It's really important that in the smoke and mirrors industry that we talk more about what doesn't go right. So that's the intention of this panel. So to kick things off, could we please nip round this way, and if you could very briefly, in about 2 to 3 minutes max, introduce yourself and then give us your best failure story.
The fact that I know how to go first is the pressure. My name is Lisbee Stainton. I am a songwriter, artist, session musician, and I'm also the head of the songwriting department at BIM College London. My biggest fail. Can I have a moment just to think? Because I'm pretty sure I've got a good one. But
should we like to start with Chris on that end?
Okay. Hello, my name's Chris. I'm now a writer and broadcaster. For 20 years I was in your trade as a singer-songwriter. Last year in 2017 I gave up, and so I've escaped your industry for a year this weekend. I'll tell two failure stories. One is a really simple one, but it's classic music industry, which is at some point my manager saying to me, "You've got to come and be tour support for this new artist." And she was at the Brit School, and she's going to be really big. And me going, "Well, she's good, but why am I her tour support? I've been doing this for years," and turning it down. And yes, it was Adele. And I've got about 7 of those. But the story I'll tell, because I kind of want to be recent and not try and pretend that all my failures happened a long time ago. As I wound up my music career last year, the thing I was doing that I was really excited about, that I am doing instead, one of the things was writing. And in the last 3 months of 2017, as we sort of did my final gigs and I said goodbye, I was piling into this really important, amazing book that was going to revolutionise the arts. And it was like a funny, witty, no-holds-barred critique of the state of the arts. It was called Great Art Doesn't Matter, How to Do It and Why Not to Bother. And it's a masterpiece. And I wrote about 65,000 words. Then as we came towards Christmas last year, I put it down and I thought, I'll leave it, I'll have a bit of space, and I'll come back to it in early spring. So I went back to it really excited at the very end of February, just, right, I'm going to finish this first draft and give it to my literary agent, and we're gonna make my new careers and it was absolute bilge from beginning to end. And what I thought was witty humour and kind of really cool, creative, snarky thought about the creative industries was bitter spewings. And what I learned was, just because I've made music and written songs for 20 years doesn't mean I'm not a beginner when it comes to writing a book. And I actually have to figure out how to do it before I do it. So that's my 2 failure stories.
Wonderful, thank you. We'll come back to them. Would you like to introduce yourself?
Yeah.
Not that you need an introduction, my God, but there you go.
I'm Martin Mills. I run the Beggars group of record labels, which are XL, 4AD, Matador, Rough Trade and Young Turks. And I've had tons of failures. But I guess one that sticks in my mind is an artist called Piers Turner, who probably no one's ever heard of, who was part of the Kurt Casey, Philip Glass scene in New York. He was Irish, but he lived in New York. And I loved the kind of mix of the grittiness of New York with the Wexford lyricism. And we signed him and we put out an album which was absolutely brilliant, and absolutely nothing happened. And then we did it again, and then we did it again. Nothing ever happened. And we parted company, remained friends. He's still a performer, so I think he's succeeding in some terms because he's must be in his 50s now. But he's still playing live and still making records on his own. But I really regret that we weren't able to make him as successful as he should have been. He should be as big as Coldplay, and he's not. And it was because of us that he isn't, to some extent.
Well, we can all look him up now and buy his album. Thank you.
I'm Leima Laiton. I'm from Brazil. I am a musician, music producer, and music director. And I moved to London in 2013. I've been working in Europe since 2004 and coming most of the months and doing DJ sets and working and performing until my manager had the great idea, you should move to London. And I'm like, cool, finally we are going to live close to where we work, because it was a bit of failure and a bit of luxury to have to go back to Brazil so often. And when we arrived here, he quitted being a manager. My agent was fired from his agency, and we're like, here. And so I consider that a failure and also a restart. So this is what I am.
Okay.
Sorry, I'm just filling with my microphone currently. This is the first thing. I think I can tell you about the failures of albums that didn't sell as much as I needed to in order to make money back. I can tell you about failures in which I have played gigs to literally other artists in the room, or on one occasion a lovely German man called Harry who'd driven 300 kilometers from Nuremberg to be in Hamburg that night, and when the doors opened, he, the lone audience member at the time, walked in, put on one of my t-shirts and stood in the center of the room. And the promoter, this very anxious-looking German guy, came up to me, and essentially one of the reasons why this was quite a big failure, one of the many reasons why this was quite a big failure of a gig, was that I had the wrong agent at the time. My first agent, this is 2010, I'd just come off the back of a very large support tour with Joan Armour Trading, and this agent decided that inexplicably I would have managed to hoover up every single Joan Armour Trading fan along the route, and that they would all inexplicably just turn up to my shows. And unsurprisingly, they did not. Harry did, but Harry was a Joan Armour Trading fan. But this German guy approached me in the dressing room, and I always, in these situations, because this isn't the only one, this is one of my favourite ones, and my approach to this is always to think to myself, well, I will play to whoever shows up, even if that is the barman and the sound guy and this promoter who clearly hates me. So this guy came in and he said very softly, he said, I think we should cancel. And I said, you need to speak either to my manager or my agent about cancelling, because I do not make those decisions. I will play. I'm here and I will play. My band is here and they will play. And we'll have fun. But I apologise that it's gone this way. Not completely my fault. And I then went and spoke to Harry, the lovely German man. And I said to him, you look very nice, and where have you come from? And he said he'd driven 300 kilometres from Nuremberg, and that it was also his 60th birthday that day. So I then went back to the promoter and said to him, just go and have a little quick chat with Harry over there, and then come back and tell me if you'd like to, again, cancel this show. And the promoter did go and speak to lovely Harry, and then he came back and he just went, okay. And we played the show, and we got 15 more walk-ins. I'd like to say it wasn't just Harry in the audience in the end. So there was a group of 16 audience members by the end of it in what was essentially a rock venue in Hamburg. And what I write is basically folk music, so this was clearly the wrong venue for me in the first place. It smelt of death. And at the end of the gig, another failure, my guitar battery ran out just as I walked on stage. So I kind of went, screw my life, and I took I told my drummer to pick up all of his percussion instruments, and I told my double bassist to unplug his microphone, and we went off the stage, which was far too high anyway for the amount of audience members we had, and we went and stood amongst them, and we gave them percussion instruments, and we played with them for 2 hours. And at the end of that show, the promoter approached me and said, beautifully, in beautiful English, with such an earnest expression, I cannot fault him, he said, Lisbee, I really think Hamburg missed a gig tonight. And I was like, okay, you were supposed to promote it, but that's okay, we'll skip that bit for the minute. But the point I'm trying to make is that failure comes in all shapes and sizes, and that you can see something as a failure, or you can see it as a roaring success. For me, that gig was one of the funnest I've ever done. Yes, my guitar battery died, that was my fault. I should have checked that. Yes, there should have been more people there, that was partially my fault, but I didn't know what I was doing at the time. That's my excuse anyway. And but it was a great success because I played to Harry, and I played to those 15 other people, and my band had a great time, and we had a good night.
Beautiful. Well, you fully exploited your moment to think about your failure story, because you've also made my job as moderator very easy, because you've already started to assess your own failure, and actually the point of today is to hopefully come to the conclusion that there is no such thing as failure, or at least that it leads to success and that it's a very important part. So we've already started unpacking that particular supposed failure. Beautiful array of different types of failure. So what have we heard so far? The difference between external and internal. External, all the things that just go wrong that are out of our control. Internal, things that we can control. Have I checked that my guitar battery is working? Martin, let's start with you. So much of today has been about building your team slowly, and all the things an artist has to do in lieu of a team. So from a record label point of view, you were saying that you obviously believed in this artist and were first and foremost a big fan of their creative output. So is there any rhyme or reason for that type of commercial failure when all the good intention is there? And could you talk us through that sort of decision-making process?
Well, I think the beauty of all that we all do is it's completely unpredictable. You can't bet on it. You can't call odds on it. And I mean, people that work with me often come up because they're depressed because they haven't got a particular newspaper article or a radio play or whatever. And I say to them, most of the things you try and do for the artists, you're probably not going to get, because there are many other people trying to get them as well. And I used to say to people, if you want everything to go right all the time, go and work in a bank. Of course, I don't say that anymore. I tell them to go work in a car factory or something, because the outputs are completely unpredictable from the inputs in what we do. And it made me think of, I do employment reviews with all my staff every year, and I was talking to someone who just joined us from Universal a few months ago, and I asked him, as I always do when people come like that, what's the difference between them and us, and what way we're different. And he said that when someone signs to when Universal signs an artist, they're always shooting for the stars. They're always aiming for that new artist to be a pop megastar. And so 99% of the time they're going to fail, because very, very few people are going to get that far. And he said the big difference with Beggars is you tailor expectations to the kind of artist you're signing. And so, success for one artist can be playing to 200 people a night in London and 300 people a night in New York and similar around the world, or it can be 100 times that. But if you set the expectations right, then failure becomes success.
So failure to setting the correct goals and failure to align the expectations is often the story, is what you're saying there.
Yes, and I love that Bob Dylan line, there's no success like failure, but failure's no success at all. It's very true.
I think we should have a From Me to You bingo, because that was the second Bob Dylan reference today, albeit this one was more poetic. And also we had an Ed Sheeran bingo, so I think we'll make the last panel a drinking game, and then if anyone, Bob Dylan or Ed Sheeran. So then when you've done everything you can, I suppose, how do you discuss that failure with an artist? Because some of the discussions we've had before is how difficult it is as an artist if the product is you to deal with that.
Well, I think if you're an artist and the product is you, then you've got to be able to face the fact that almost everything is a failure. Because there's always somewhere more you can go. If you're top 40, you could be top 30, and if you're number one, why you're number one the following week as well. So there's always a point where you hit that failure thing, but it can't matter. You can't let it matter. You have to ignore the failures and build on successes.
There's a tweet. So Chris, I think the story that you were talking about it's funny with all your stories. We're speaking about failure. And every time you actually unpack a story that's under that title, when as a listener you often think like, oh, that's not failure, is it? And Chris, when you were talking, especially about the book, or well, no, with Adele as well, it's it's hindsight, isn't it? There are, as Martin pointed out, there are so many unknowns, and so much of this industry is unpredictable. It was probably a sound assessment at the time when you were offered that tour support. It may have been a bit of, a misplaced sort of ego or hubris, and we all have that as artists as well, but it was probably a safe assessment. Is this tour going to be worthwhile? Do I need to be a support anymore? Maybe a manager told you at the time, Chris, you really shouldn't be doing tour supports anymore. So hindsight is, as we all know, 2020. So what's your viewpoint on that?
Well, what's my viewpoint on hindsight being 2020 is I firmly agree. And it's like poker. It's you can play really well and still lose, or you can play like shit and win sometimes, and it takes a really great player to grind out the averages to win over a long period of time. But even the greatest poker players sometimes lose big and lose hard because they did the right thing but the wrong thing happened. So if we're all playing a game that has some elements of skill, and some of the more kind of advisory talks at an event like this will give a lot of really useful tips about what to do and how to be, but at the same time the luck element is huge. And a couple of things I wanted to say. I kept wanting to say, in every genre and for every style, there's an artist who is a global smash. There is in my opinion, there is a superior artist that isn't a success, that might have a bit of critical success. And that's not just in, you could find a C6 Steve and find Charlie Parr. And you could do that in any, and funnily enough, you mentioned Ed Sheeran and you mentioned Bob Dylan. Ed Sheeran's a bigger live artist than Bob Dylan has ever been, even at his heights. Ed Sheeran has done the biggest acoustic solo concerts of all time in history in the world. So how are we defining success and failure? Are we going to say, well, actually, Ed Sheeran's a bit more of a success than Bob Dylan because he played to bigger crowds? Well, I've forgotten my other point now. Dig myself out of a hole.
It's a wonderful point about, obviously this is all irrelevant. Martin, earlier on, before we were on stage, you said, one person's failure is another person's success. So much of our perceived failure is just the expectations we have of ourselves, right? Whether that's we're on the creative side or on the business side of things, we have the aspiration, and it's us who are deeming it a failure.
Can I throw one quick healthy thing in the pot, which is that we aren't the product, our music is the product. And one healthy long-term thing may be to slightly separate our music from ourselves. And I know that nowadays particularly, that is very mushed up. We are our own marketing people, we are our own sales people of our own music. And so it gets all muddled up. You will be a failure or a success in the commercial sphere, largely because of who you are, not entirely purely the music. But for self-care, for reasons of self-care, if you can separate out you from the music you're making at the time, so that a failure becomes, this project's a failure, but that's not me, that's this thing, then that might be a positive thing to take out of it.
Top tip.
Can I add to that as well? Because that is a super important point, I think, and it is something very much to do with the way we approach it ourselves as artists, but also how the industry itself, the language it uses to describe artists. I know there must be people in this room who've had this experience as well, but anyone who's ever used a radio plugger and has gone into Radio 6 music, Radio 2, wherever with a single, and your plugger comes out after the meeting and just goes, they're not going to play you. The language being, they're not going to play you. They're not going to play the song that you wrote and presented to them. If you pitch in a business meeting a presentation about quarterly something, this is why I'm in the music industry.
Cheese sales.
Yeah. and it's not, and your income is going down for whatever reason, and the boss gets unhappy. They don't go. They don't start referring to your presentation as you. That would be a very strange thing to do. And yet, in the music industry, that is exactly what we do. It is a project. It is not you. And yes, we have personas, and the last panel absolutely touched brilliantly on this, in that, yes, we can't help but become what we are creating, particularly when we assign so much heart and passion and joy and so much of ourselves into what we create. Creation creative activity by nature is part of you. Then the next step, when you are pushing that thing you've made out into the world, that's when you go, that is not me. I put me into it, but it's not me anymore. It's a lovely little furry creature that's its own thing, and I've just dressed it, and off it pops.
You need to let go of your fairy creature once you've released it, was the moral to that story. So I'd like to put one more point until we move on to have the positive spin on all of the failure. Both of your stories involved failure of a team and good working together in one form or another. So can you give some tips to the many artists in the room? What do you do when a working relationship fails? How do you deal with that? How do you move on?
So when I was speaking to you over the phone, I was telling you that I tried to make my own kind of spiritual anxiety controlling rituals, because as a musician, you made this creature and you made this new kid, this children, and you have to let it go. And then it's not you anymore, as we already know, but it's something you're very attached to and you want the best for it. So it is quite like, it is very, very deep in you, and it's a lot of anxiety into the process. So sometimes I tend to do a lot of meditation and a lot of like deep thoughts on trying to perceive that it's not only me, it's the world, it's all of the things are happening in a very like it's meant to be a no as well, you know, like, and then when you start accepting that, okay, you have to get a no for that, and not trying to be pushy and like, hey, why is it a no? Why don't you like my music? Why don't you? Then you start accepting the others as well. Maybe it's not time for the label to give me that space, and maybe it's not even me who should be trying to ask this label, hey, please listen to me. And that leaves you a bit in a more comfortable place so you can create more. That's what I feel, you know. So I think at this moment in life, even with failures I had, a mom to 5 kids. I'm married to this guy who has a band and it's also a musician. And we have fed the 5 kids for all of this time only with music. So if I remember this, even if I'm not in a Billboard or like in the #1 charts, I'm like, yeah, that's not as a failure as I would think. You know, so.
Music is my favorite food as well.
Not my kids, they hate it.
Same.
They're like, I don't want to participate in this world because I know it's a struggle.
Oh,
they're like,
we
don't want to be
pudding
musicians. They don't want to be musicians. They're like, that's the worst thing.
Well, and just in terms of teams, I mean, again, it is, I think it, so in the last 3 years I've been teaching, and I started off as a songwriting tutor at BIM London, and I inexplicably have been given the role of head of department. So I'm now responsible for all these lovely, fantastic, talented young songwriters in this college. And something that I have found myself telling them, partly to persuade myself, I think, as well as them, is that making mistakes is learning. Failure is learning. Failure is progress. I failed my grade 8 guitar exam, partly because I was too drunk, because it was my freshers' first term of uni, and partly because I didn't want it. I didn't need it. I was an active and gigging songwriter by that point. I didn't feel I needed my classical grade 8 guitar. And hilariously, when I admitted that I'd failed it to my ex-head teacher at secondary school, she laughed at me, which is probably not the best thing to have done, quite frankly, but she laughed at me, and I was like, oh, that's not the reaction I was expecting. I was probably expecting sympathy or, oh, never mind, you can go again. And she went, no, good, you needed to fail that. And I went, and since then I've gone, actually, she's right, you need to fail. You need to have things go wrong. You need to make one of your furry creatures, because that's the analogy I'm running with now, and they need to fall in a pond every now and again and flap about a bit, and that's fine, because they'll learn to swim. But in terms of teams, you cannot, the failure is not always on you, but it's not always just dumping it on someone else either. I've fired many agents, not because they're awful, but because the relationship wasn't right, or the work they were doing was wrong for me, or our working relation, it just wasn't working. That's not failure. That's actually good. That I was able to identify that, or we were able to identify that, and we parted ways and I moved on. And that is the best thing you can do. You cannot sit, in every sense of life, you cannot sit with something that isn't working. If it doesn't work, move on. That's not failure. That's not even sometimes making mistakes. That's just life.
Wonderful. Perfect segue to talking about the importance of failure for creativity. Musically, music would be very, very boring if we didn't take any risks. One might argue that more mainstream music, there is a lot of risk aversion and therefore very boring music. Beggars is notorious for being exactly the opposite of that, for taking creative risks with the bands they work with. So perhaps first from a label point of view and then from an artist point of view, could we nip round and talk about the importance of creating space and allowing yourself to take risks musically?
I think it's really crucial, and whenever an artist asks me what they should be doing in the studio, I'd say take risks, challenge yourself. I think the big mainstream music industry is, as you say, risk averse. They generally speaking make music for radio, or maybe these days make music for playlists, and that's by necessity safe. But that's exactly the opposite of everything that we do. And it almost doesn't need saying. It's kind of so obvious. I mean, I think in every area of life, great people are people who fail, and they fail because they take risks. Like if you watch Michael Schumacher driving, he goes off the track. He does it because he's trying to go a little bit faster than is safe. So the great people at anything are great because they take risks and they go to the edge. And certainly that's what we always encourage our artists to do. And most of them do it themselves. We've got many artists who've made a successful record and immediately react against that success. I mean, we had a band called Love and Rockets who came out of Bauhaus, had an enormous hit with a song called So Alive, and the next record they made was almost unlistenable because they didn't want to pander to the people who like So Alive.
Can you think of a time in Beggars where you took a creative risk that paid off, where you had to fight for that creative decision, or where you felt, ooh, this is a big risk?
You have to give me some time to think about that. Ask someone else something.
So artists, how do you create? How do you do that? Because on the one hand, we all know what it's like. We get advice, solicited and unsolicited advice all the time when we share our music or from our business, how we go about our business. Oh, I like this mix, but turn up the bass. Or I like this, but have you tried to make it sound more like an orange? So how... Have you never had that? How do you allow yourself to take those creative risks and to not listen to people?
One thing for me would be to know what it is you're doing at that moment. So if I think of this audience as quite commercially ambitious. I think that there is, however much we want to keep our soul intact, we're a bunch of commercially ambitious people on the whole. But the really useful thing is to know when that's what you're doing, and know when what you're doing is not that, but is pure creative expression for your own joy, and to do both, but to always know which you're doing. So, for example, if you're in a studio and you're thinking about radio plays or playlisting on Spotify, or you're thinking about what your live crowd will think of it, be aware that that's what's in your head at that time and accept that sometimes you're going to do that. Years ago, I was on a panel with Dave Rowntree from Blur, who came up with loads of people have said it, but the 3 hits rule. If you make a record and it's got 3 hits on, then you can do absolutely what the fuck you like for the rest of the record. No one's going to care in the business. So you can really create to your heart's content, but just make sure you got your 3 hits. So there's that sense of self-awareness of what you're doing at that moment. And I think that's really important. I think when I started my career, I was much better at just creative stuff for my own sake. And as a result, my music was more psychedelic and had more interesting things going on and was more acclaimed, but didn't do so commercially well. And as my career sort of got on and I got more immersed in the idea that I had to be part of an industry and wanted to be more successful, I think now, with the benefit of hindsight, my music got less imaginative. In some ways, I think craft is a problem as well. Like, we get better at our craft over time. Whatever, you practice your craft, you get better, and there's a risk that getting better at your craft means you lose those moments of taking total. I like when you press a button and you don't know what the button does, and it's amazing. But the problem is, 10 years later, you know what all the buttons do, and so there's that spark isn't necessarily going to happen. So I do think that's really important to know what your intention is at that moment. Is maybe what I'm blathering on about.
Know what your intention is, know what you're wanting to do, but don't know what all the buttons do.
Yeah, like if you're yes. Yes.
I think everyone in this room, I have heavily including myself, has written some pretty naff songs.
Oh, no, I never did that.
No? Apart from Chris, we've all written some really naff songs. And the whole point of that is, you're right, it's actually, weirdly, I'm going to join in the Ed Sheeran bingo here, because it was actually in an Ed Sheeran interview that I heard a phrase that I absolutely love. He said, writing songs when you first start is a bit like turning a tap on that hasn't been turned on for like 20 years. And when you first turn it on, what you're going to get out is a lot of twigs and mud and crap, basically. You've got to wait for the water to run clear. And I was like, that is lovely. You need to find all the crap. You need to get through all the twigs and the mud and the rubbish before you find whatever it is that comes out afterwards, the clear water. And then after that, you might turn another tap or press a different button and see what happens there. Unless you're on a nuclear submarine, so maybe avoid that one. But in terms of creative risk-taking, that's what songwriters do. Songwriters only take risks. When you're creating something, you are by nature taking a risk. The level is how much and how far are you willing to push it, and what is your intention, and also whose voice are you making this in? Is it yours? Is it someone else's? Are you collaborating with and for an artist, or for an unspecified mythical artist that you don't know yet who may take it up? You need to know these things when you're writing, and therefore you know the level of risk that you can take with what you're writing. And sometimes you might sit down in a collaboration, and I've had this where someone just goes, "Oh God, can we stop writing pop?" And I'll go, "Yeah, all right." And the producer went, "Why don't we write something weird?" And we wrote what is probably one of the worst songs any of us have ever written. But it was so much fun. So you've got to do this stuff. And that creativity is risk, and risk is not bad.
Failure to know yourself, failure to know what you're trying to achieve, I suppose. Leima, as one of your many roles is to be the musical director of this musical project called Girls. So that's how do you deal with a situation like that when there's 10 creative heads in a room?
Well, I had no idea how to music direct until I was challenged to do this work with women in places of conflict and crisis. And music for them is more than what not more, but it's different than what we do as a music career. Music for them is also getting out of the places they are and like the situations they are, and it's an escape valve of like ideas. And so it is very challenging when you have more people. It's like very, very all over the place. But also it goes back to what Chris says. You have a goal, you have an intention. You're like, we have to build out of this. What do we have? We are women. We are all from places of conflict and crisis. And how are we going to show the world that? So that is the intention. And then we take the risks. And then we start like, okay, I'm going to sing in Debele and I'm going to press the buttons. And I was suggesting to put some Kraftwerk samples, and these ladies are like, Kraft who? And I'm like, good, you have no idea who Kraftwerk is? I love it. So in that melting pot, some things come up, and then you have to be very wise what you're going to choose. And as Lisbee was saying, let the water, a lot of dark water came out of the tap first, and very confusing, very all over the place, but also very honest. It's very what we were in that moment. And then as a musical director, you have to go there and try to pick up this and be democratic, and it's another role. It's very different. So, but it has all of the assets that what they said.
Martin, did you want to add something, or have you thought of a risk that you were particularly proud of with hindsight?
Yeah, I have. It's from the same era as the previous one, a band called The Cult, who we used to have, who had a big record, an album called Love, and a single called She's Our Sanctuary, which was very kind of layered and goth and reverby and tons and tons of guitars. And they came to make the second album with the same producer, Steve Brown, and it sounded kind of the same, only more so, more reverb, and about 12 guitars on every track instead of 6. And to be fair to the band, the risk taking was theirs and their managers, not ours. At that point, we'd spent all the money we had to spend on the record, so we were quite keen to accept it because times were tough in those days. But the band said we think that's shit. We want to do it again, and they went and met Rick Rubin, who in those days was unknown, and re-recorded Love Removal Machine in Electric Ladyland in New York, and it sounded completely different. The previous version, I'd say, had 12 layers of guitars. This one had 1. It sounded really stark and like Free the band. Completely different. And it worked. And that album, which became Electric, was as big as the one before. And it sounded completely different. And they took a real risk in being very different, and it paid off.
It's an amazing record.
So good.
Wonderful, thank you. So, what have we learnt? We would try to recap here. So, we've learnt that failure is absolutely fundamental in order to learn and to get good at a thing. Failure is essentially, if there's no failure, I suppose we've learnt that if you don't fail, it means you've not made a decision and you've not tried. Right. And on that note, before we head to questions, there you go. There's another failure. I'm on stage, so I've failed to appoint a person to get the radio mic for questions. Would someone like to volunteer to do that?
Is there something about recognising failure in that we are now being schooled very aggressively not to acknowledge our failures? We market ourselves so completely that we tell all our friends that everything's sold 4 times what it really sold. No gig isn't a sellout, you know. Is there a thing about, and I don't mean this necessarily publicly, but at least acknowledging to ourselves that a project is not working so that we then change it or move on? I mean, it took a leap from what you're saying. It took a band leap for the Cult to go from something from there to go, and they got it done, to go, right, this isn't good enough. And you weren't even pushing them to do that. So there is something about spotting when you're not quite as good as you could be.
I think it links neatly into social media and all that kind of thing. When someone said this earlier, we are expected to present ourselves as this almighty being constantly on Instagram or Facebook or Twitter or whatever it is you're using. And that is a lot of pressure in itself, put that on top of a creative person as well. And you've got and almost no room to admit where things are going wrong. And it is wonderful, and I'm again overlapping slightly with the other panels, but it is wonderful to have stuff like this where you can sit down and go, I played a really shit gig and I was awful. But I know now. I mean, I've tried things on stage that haven't worked at all, and usually I find it in the moment very funny and then feel mortified afterwards because I present it as, oh, isn't that fun? That went horribly wrong and now you're all staring at me weirdly. And then afterwards I'll be metaphorically banging my head against a wall and feeling awful because I'm not willing to admit publicly at the time that went wrong. And pretend, we're so used to pretending everything's fine in every sense in the industry that it can be very, very difficult to admit. And perhaps the first place to start is with yourself, maybe.
Thank you so much. So know yourself, be able to assess the situation, know when a working relationship isn't working out, know when you need to take a few more risks with a project, know when it feels wrong and when it feels like you're on the right track. And it's really nice that one of the morals from this panel, I suppose, is just trust yourself. You know, trust your gut, trust your creative, fluffy animals, and then let them go and call them a project. How's that for a recap?
Yeah, many times it's not in the head. You're right. It's not in the thoughts. It's not like looped in this like what we believe and what we think and what we see. Many times it has to be in the gut. It has to be feelings. It has to be your creative input. Because when we're stuck here, we get lost. Yeah.
Are there any questions on failure?
Hello. Why are we so afraid of failing? I mean, I'm thinking, I'm sort of connecting it to like being vulnerable, that whole thing, which is usually like very scary. But then again, in a creative process, vulnerability is a pretty good input to have. It's maybe a quite deep question, but why are we so afraid of failure? Like, I agree with all of you, but I know that we're still, I mean, at least I am afraid of failure. Why? Why is that?
I think that there's, on a strictly commercial level, it's because failure breeds failure. I mean, if you put out a record that did less well than your previous one, and then you go back to, let's say, Amazon, and try and sell in the third one, they'll say, well, the second one didn't do as well as the first one, so we're not going to take it. But so in an age where everything is monitored and everything is tracked and everything is reported, I think there's the fear of escalation and failure.
Absolutely, and I think that purely on a human level, part of it's a survival code, is it not? It's a primal thing. If you fail, you're the weakest member of the herd, and that dinosaur's going to eat you. So. To put it mildly, but on a creative level, it's easy when you are told by many sources and by society and social conditioning and the industry you're in that if you fail, you are rubbish. That translates to you as it's not a failure of work or failure of action, it's a failure of self. Yeah, and it's easy to translate, going back to an example of a radio plugger not managing to get your song onto Radio 2, and the reason for that might have been because Kylie Minogue decided to release an album, and that could be it, and it's just that last slot on that playlist went to her. Of course it did, it's Kylie Minogue. so that's not your failure, but it will translate to you as that. They won't play you, okay, they won't play me. I am the thing that was supposed to be played. I didn't do something well. I failed. I'm awful. So failure is not a judgment. Failure becomes a judgment of self at that point. That's my interpretation.
We've probably got time for one more quick question. If there is one.
Who was first?
Okay, fine. 2 questions.
2 questions.
Hi, so I'll be very quick. Thanks, everyone. You've talked a lot about things you've done that failed. I wondered if there's something that you have failed to do that you wish you had or you might do next year.
Well, that's a really great question because that leads on to the biggest failure, which is failing to not try or failing to do a thing. So apart from not supporting Adele on tour, any regrets of not doing a thing, panel?
I stuck with business relationships far too long. I wish I'd sacked people much quicker, and that's a reflection of who I am as a person as well. So all my social relationships tend to be I would stick with a relationship beyond its usefulness. Can I answer the previous question with one word? Capitalism.
Amazing. Final question.
Sorry, I want to spin this whole story around. You've been very positive about failure. What happens when the tax man, your mother, the council are all saying, okay, face facts. You're not making your career work. We're subsidizing your life. How about getting a proper job, give up music, and start earning some real money because this isn't working? is there a time when you've got to admit you are a failure, even though you are in the charts, you're self-releasing, so in your mind you are a success? So who do you believe? The people who are trying to kick you out of your house, or like Amazon and Beatport charts and things like that?
Before the panel answers that, thank you for your question. Let's take the panel's advice on straight away and rephrase some of what you said. Even if all of that happens, I think we've learned today that that doesn't mean that you are a failure. That means that perhaps this particular project is failing. Panel?
That's what I was going to say.
Oh, sorry.
No, that's good. I think I would suggest that that particular story you wove is perhaps more a case of bad finance management than anything else. If you're doing a project that isn't working, you need to find something else that will. Now, that might be, someone earlier said, don't be afraid, it was Rooks, don't be afraid to take a second job, but don't be afraid to take a second job. Well, yeah, you can do that, yeah. Or if you're doing something independently, so you're doing an independent artist project and you're making an album and you feel like you're just siphoning money into this and that's it, then you need to find a better way, more effective way of doing that. It's making it more effective, not going, I am failing, I think.
Yeah, I think it's very interesting because in Brazil we call ourselves, when we're in that situation of like, oh, you're good, like everyone looks at you like, wow, you go on tour, woo, you've traveled all over. So in their minds they're like, oh, you're making money and you're selling your stuff on Amazon. So we call ourselves the poor stars because we're still stars, but we're like broke, poor stars. We're sat down there, we're like, how do we pay the bills now? And I think it's right. Sometimes we can also find other hats to use within music and try to find our paths. Normally we don't need to work in the bank 9 to 5. We can't find other tools. So I really think it's like Lisbee said, there's a lot of other stuff to do in music. And I've only learned this recently when I was abandoned by my super top agent and cool manager. And I was like, should I go back to Brazil where I was set as a poor star, or should I stay here? And I insisted in staying here and finding other things to do. And like being here today is one of these things. You know, it's not that I'm getting paid or anything, but it's like so important to be here and to exchange with all these minds, because that's going to nurture ourselves to go out of here and do more stuff.
I think in life, if you keep doing something that continually doesn't work, at some point you have to face that and maybe draw the conclusions. I mean, if you keep trying to make souffles that keep not rising, then you're not a souffle maker. I found a story. We had a band called China Drum, who were a Geordie band from Newcastle, who were kind of punkish, and they were really great. They had a first pretty successful album, second album that was less successful, and after that, you know, we couldn't invest in them anymore, and it just all faded and disappeared into nothing. And a few years later, I got a letter from Adam, the singer, who was by then working on a building site. He was very happy working on a building site, loved his life, and he wrote to say that at the time when he'd been in a band and working with us and touring the world, whatever they achieved, it was fabulous. He wouldn't have missed it for the world. It was the best time he'd ever had. No regrets.
Brilliant.
Oh, what an amazing, I was just about to say what an amazing place to close, if that's okay.
No, close. No, you can. That's fine.
You could have responded to that.
That was a better point.
Okay, well, thank you so much to our panel. Can we have a huge round of applause for Lisbee, Leima, Martin, and Chris?